My girlfriend hid her ex in her friend group for months, so I let her lie. Then made a move that shut her up for good. I'm 29 years old, and 6 months ago I discovered that my girlfriend of 2 years had been deliberately hiding her ex-boyfriend in her friend group, while lying to my face about their history together. My girlfriend Tessa and I had been living together for 8 months when I finally figured out that her close friend Jake wasn't just some random guy from work, but actually her ex-boyfriend of 3 years who she'd never stopped being emotionally involved with. Let me explain how this deception unfolded so you understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. When Tessa and I first started dating, she told me about her friend group from work, which included several people she'd hang out with regularly for happy hours, weekend activities, and group dinners. She described them as her closest friends and support system in the city. Jake was always mentioned as part of this group. Tessa would talk about Jake's opinions on movies, Jake's suggestions for restaurants, Jake's involvement in planning group activities. She'd show me group photos from their outings where Jake was always present, and she'd relay funny stories about things Jake had said or done during their hangouts. But Tessa never introduced me to any of these work friends, including Jake. Whenever I suggested meeting her friend group or joining them for one of their activities, she'd make excuses about why the timing wasn't right or why it would be weird to bring a boyfriend into their established dynamic. They're really close-knit, she'd explain. It takes time for new people to fit in with the group, and I don't want to rush things and make everyone uncomfortable. I found it odd that after 6 months of dating, I still hadn't met any of Tessa's closest friends, but I didn't want to pressure her or seem clingy about being included in every aspect of her social life. The red flags started when I noticed how Tessa's mood would change after spending time with her friend group. She'd come home from their gatherings seeming distracted and emotionally charged, like something significant had happened that she was processing. When I'd ask about her evening, she'd give vague answers about having fun but wouldn't share any specific details. More concerning was how protective Tessa became of her phone when she was around me. She'd angle the screen away when texting, take calls in another room, and seem nervous when notifications would pop up while we were together. When I casually asked who she was talking to, she'd usually say it was someone from the friend group making plans or sharing something funny. The frequency of these group activities seemed excessive for casual work friendships. Tessa was hanging out with these people 3 or 4 times a week, often staying out late and coming home with stories about deep conversations and emotional bonding experiences that sounded more intimate than typical friend group interactions. But what really bothered me was how Jake featured prominently in almost every story Tessa told about her social life. Jake had suggested the restaurant they tried. Jake had made everyone laugh with his impressions. Jake had given Tessa advice about a work situation. For someone who was supposedly just one member of a larger friend group, Jake seemed to have an unusually central role in Tessa's social experiences. When I mentioned noticing how often Jake came up in her stories, Tessa became defensive and accused me of being jealous of her friendships. She said Jake was just a naturally charismatic person who brought people together, and that it was normal for him to be involved in planning activities and facilitating group conversations. "You don't understand the dynamic," she'd say when I expressed concerns about her apparent closeness with Jake. "He's like the social coordinator of our group. Everyone goes to him for advice and planning because he's good at bringing people together." But her explanations never quite made sense. If Jake was just the group's social coordinator, why would Tessa need to have private phone conversations with him several times a week? Why would she be emotionally affected by their group hangouts if they were just casual work friendships? The turning point came when Tessa started talking about Jake's dating life and how the group was trying to help him meet someone new. She'd mentioned women Jake was interested in, group discussions about his relationship goals, and plans to set him up with people they knew. "Jake's been having a hard time getting over his last relationship," Tessa explained during one of these conversations. "It was really serious, and he's been struggling to move on. We're all trying to help him get back out there." Something about the way Tessa talked about Jake's romantic struggles seemed too invested for someone who was supposedly just a supportive friend. She knew intimate details about his emotional state, his dating preferences, and his relationship history that suggested a level of involvement that went beyond casual friendship. That's when I decided to do some investigation into exactly who Jake was and what his relationship with Tessa had really been. I started by looking at Tessa's social media history, going back to before we'd started dating to see if I could find any evidence of their past interactions. What I discovered in old photos and posts completely changed my understanding of Tessa's friend group and Jake's role in her life. But instead of confronting her immediately with what I'd learned, I decided to let her continue lying while I gathered more evidence and planned my response. Sometimes the best way to deal with deception is to let the deceiver believe they're getting away with it while you document exactly how extensive their lies have been. Tessa thought she was successfully hiding Jake's true identity from me, but she had no idea that I was about to expose the entire fiction she'd constructed around their relationship. The confrontation that was coming would reveal not just that Jake was her ex-boyfriend, but that their friend group had been a carefully constructed cover story for what was essentially an ongoing emotional affair that had been happening throughout our entire relationship. Once I started looking carefully at Tessa's social media history, the truth about Jake became obvious within minutes. Going back through her Instagram and Facebook posts from 2 and 3 years ago, I found dozens of photos of Tessa and Jake together as a clearly romantic couple, not as members of a casual friend group. There were pictures of them at romantic dinners, couples trips to the beach, holiday celebrations where they were obviously together as boyfriend and girlfriend. Jake appeared in family photos at Tessa's parents' house, posed with her at weddings as her date, and featured in posts with captions like 2 years with this amazing man, and grateful for my partner and everything. The timeline showed that Tessa and Jake had dated for over 3 years, breaking up approximately 4 months before she and I had started seeing each other. But even more revealing was that Jake continued to appear in her social media posts even after their apparent breakup, just with more careful captioning that made him seem like a friend rather than an ex-boyfriend. I found posts from the early months of our relationship where Jake was still present at Tessa's social gatherings, but now he was described as part of her work friends or amazing friend group, rather than identified by name as someone she'd previously dated. The most damaging evidence came from scrolling through 3 years of their digital interactions. Comments on each other's posts that were flirtatious and intimate, inside jokes that suggested ongoing emotional connection, and patterns of interaction that looked nothing like casual friendship between people who'd moved on from a romantic relationship. But social media was just the beginning of my investigation. I started paying closer attention to Tessa's behavior and conversations, documenting inconsistencies in her stories about the friend group and noting details that didn't make sense if Jake was really just a platonic friend. I noticed that Tessa never mentioned other members of this friend group by name, despite supposedly spending multiple evenings a week with them. When she'd tell stories about their activities, it was always, "We went to dinner," or "the group decided to try that new bar," but she'd never specify who we, or the group, actually included besides Jake. When I asked direct questions about other people in the friend group, Tessa would give vague answers about coworkers whose names I wouldn't recognize, but she could never provide specific details about these supposed friends or their relationships with Jake. The phone behavior became even more suspicious once I knew what to look for. Tessa would receive texts that would make her smile in a way that seemed too personal for casual group planning. She'd have phone conversations in another room that would last for an hour or more, supposedly about work-friend drama that required extensive discussion and emotional support. Most telling was how Tessa's schedule revolved around Jake's availability. When she'd tell me about friend group plans, they were always dependent on when Jake could join them. If Jake was busy, the group wouldn't get together. If Jake suggested an activity, everyone would rearrange their schedules to participate. I started documenting these patterns, keeping notes about Tessa's stories and tracking inconsistencies in her explanations about the friend group dynamic. What emerged was a clear picture of an ongoing emotional relationship between Tessa and Jake that was being disguised as group friendship. The breakthrough in my investigation came when I discovered that Jake didn't actually work at the same company as Tessa. Through some careful social media stalking, I found Jake's LinkedIn profile, which showed that he worked for a completely different company across town. The work friends story that had been the foundation of Tessa's explanation for their ongoing relationship was completely fabricated. This meant that Tessa was maintaining regular contact with her ex-boyfriend, spending multiple evenings a week with him, having lengthy private phone conversations, and lying to me about the basic facts of how they knew each other and why they were still involved in each other's lives. But I still needed more evidence before confronting Tessa, because I wanted to understand the full scope of their ongoing relationship and whether it was purely emotional or if there were physical aspects I hadn't discovered yet. I decided to test Tessa's commitment to her story by asking more detailed questions about the friend group and seeing how she'd handle increased scrutiny of her explanations. "I'd really like to meet your work friends," I told her one evening after she'd returned from another group hangout. "Especially Jake, since you talk about him so much. Maybe we could all get dinner together this weekend." Tessa's reaction was immediate panic, though she tried to hide it behind casual deflection. "Oh, they're all really busy this weekend," she said quickly. "And honestly, I think it might be weird to suddenly bring you into the group dynamic. You know how friend groups can be about new people. But we've been together for almost 2 years, I pointed out. At what point do I stop being new to your closest friends? Tessa became defensive and accused me of pressuring her to merge our social lives in ways that might be uncomfortable for everyone involved. She said I was being needy about meeting people who were important to her, and that I should trust her judgment about when and how to introduce me to her friend group. But her protests only confirmed what I already suspected. There was no friend group, and Jake wasn't someone she could introduce me to without revealing their actual history together. That's when I decided to plan a confrontation that would expose not just Jake's true identity, but the entire elaborate deception Tessa had constructed to hide their ongoing relationship from me. Instead of confronting Tessa directly with the evidence I'd gathered, I decided to create a situation where her lies would be exposed naturally and undeniably. I wanted her to experience the consequences of her deception in a way that would make it impossible for her to deflect, minimize, or blame me for being suspicious or controlling. My plan required some careful coordination, but the goal was simple: arrange for Jake and me to meet in a context where Tessa couldn't control the narrative or prepare explanations for their obvious history together. The opportunity came when Tessa mentioned that her friend group was planning to attend a local food and wine festival that weekend. She said Jake was organizing the outing, and that several people from work would be joining them for an afternoon of trying different vendors and enjoying live music. It sounds fun, I said casually. Maybe I'll check it out too. I've been wanting to try some of the local wineries that are supposed to be there. Tessa immediately looked uncomfortable. Oh, you don't need to come to that, she said quickly. It's going to be pretty work-focused, and I think it would be boring for you since you don't know anyone. That's exactly why I should come, I replied. It would be a perfect opportunity to finally meet your work friends, especially Jake since you talk about him so much. I could see panic building in Tessa's expression as she tried to think of reasons why my attendance would be problematic. I just think it would be awkward to bring you when it's already been planned as a work group thing, she said. Maybe next time we can plan something specifically to introduce you to everyone. But I persisted, explaining that food and wine festivals were public events where it wouldn't be intrusive for me to show up independently, even if I wasn't officially part of their group plans. I don't have to hang out with you guys the whole time, I said. I can just explore the festival on my own and maybe say hi if we run into each other. Tessa spent the rest of the week trying to talk me out of attending the festival, making increasingly desperate excuses about why it would be inconvenient or inappropriate for me to be there. Her anxiety about the possibility of Jake and me meeting was obvious and confirmed everything I'd suspected about their relationship. The day of the festival, I arrived early and positioned myself near the entrance where I could observe Tessa's group when they arrived. I wanted to see their dynamic without them knowing I was watching, so I could gather evidence of how Jake and Tessa interacted when they thought they were unobserved. When Tessa's group arrived, the truth about their relationship was immediately obvious. There was no friend group from work. It was just Tessa and Jake, along with one other couple who appeared to be actual friends rather than colleagues. Jake and Tessa were walking close together, talking intimately, and displaying body language that looked nothing like casual friendship. I watched them for about 20 minutes, documenting their interactions with photos and video on my phone. They were touching each other casually, sharing food in ways that seemed intimate, and generally behaving like people who were romantically involved rather than ex-partners who had successfully transitioned to platonic friendship. But the most revealing moment came when Jake leaned in to whisper something in Tessa's ear, and she responded by playfully pushing him and laughing in a way that was unmistakably flirtatious. There was no question that these two people were maintaining some kind of romantic or sexual tension despite Tessa's claims that they were just friends. After gathering enough evidence of their inappropriate behavior, I decided to make my presence known in a way that would create maximum awkwardness and force Tessa to explain the obvious discrepancies between her stories and reality. I approached their group casually, as if I just happened to spot them while exploring the festival independently. "Tessa," I called out, waving and walking toward them with a big smile. "What a coincidence seeing you here." The look of absolute terror on Tessa's face was priceless. She froze completely, clearly trying to figure out how to handle the situation she'd been dreading for weeks. "Hi," she said weakly, her voice barely audible over the festival music. I walked directly up to Jake and extended my hand with friendly enthusiasm. "You must be Jake," I said cheerfully. "I'm Ben, Tessa's boyfriend. I've heard so much about you from the work friend group stories. It's great to finally meet one of her closest friends." Jake looked confused by my overly friendly demeanor and glanced at Tessa uncertainly, clearly not understanding why she hadn't mentioned having a boyfriend or why I was referring to him as a work friend. Work friend, Jake repeated, looking between Tessa and me with growing confusion. Yeah, Tessa's always talking about her friend group from work, I continued enthusiastically. She says you're like the social coordinator who organizes all the group activities. It's so cool that you guys have such a tight-knit work family. Jake's confusion deepened. I don't work with Tessa, he said slowly. We used to date. For 3 years. The silence that followed was absolutely perfect. Tessa stood frozen between us, watching her carefully constructed lie fall apart in real time. Jake was staring at her with obvious bewilderment about why she'd apparently told her new boyfriend that they were just work friends. Oh, I said, pretending to be surprised by this revelation. That's interesting. Tessa told me you were coworkers who'd become really close friends. I turned to look at Tessa with an expression of innocent confusion. Why would you tell me Jake was a work friend when he's actually your ex-boyfriend? That's when Tessa realized that her months of deception had just been exposed in the most embarrassing way possible, in front of the person she'd been lying about, with no possibility of explaining away the obvious inconsistencies in her story. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever as Tessa stood there realizing that her elaborate deception had just collapsed in front of both her boyfriend and her ex-boyfriend. Jake was staring at her with a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding, while I maintained my expression of innocent bewilderment about this surprising revelation. I can explain, Tessa said finally, her voice shaky and defensive. Please do, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the voice recording app. I'm really curious to hear how you explain telling me for 2 years that Jake was a work friend when he's actually your ex-boyfriend of 3 years. Tessa's eyes widened when she saw that I was recording our conversation, but she was trapped in a situation where any explanation she gave would only make her deception more obvious. It's complicated, she began, but Jake interrupted her. Wait, he said, looking directly at me. She told you I was a work friend? We dated for 3 years and broke up right before she started seeing you. How did she explain why we were still hanging out all the time? She said you were part of her close friend group from work, I explained to Jake. She told me you were the social coordinator who organized group activities and that she'd never introduced me to any of you because the group was tight-knit and it would be weird to bring a boyfriend into the established dynamic. Jake's expression shifted from confusion to anger as he realized how extensively Tessa had lied about their relationship. There's no friend group from work, he said flatly. It's just been us hanging out, like we always did when we were dating. I thought you knew we were broken up, but I assumed you were okay with us staying close friends. Now it was my turn to look confused, though I was actually pleased that Jake was providing even more evidence of Tessa's deception than I'd expected. You thought she was okay with you staying close friends? I asked. What did she tell you about our relationship? Jake glanced at Tessa, who was looking increasingly desperate as the full scope of her lies became apparent to both of us. She said you guys were casual, Jake admitted. She told me you weren't exclusive, and that you were fine with her maintaining close friendships with people she'd dated before. I stared at Tessa, who was now caught in lies she'd told the both of us. Casual? I repeated. We've been living together for 8 months. We've talked about getting engaged. How is that casual? The other couple who'd been with Jake and Tessa were watching this confrontation with obvious discomfort, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. But I wasn't finished exposing the full extent of Tessa's manipulation. Jake, I said, when you and Tessa hang out together, what do you usually do? We get dinner, go to movies, talk about our relationship problems, Jake said, apparently not realizing how inappropriate this sounded. The same stuff we did when we were dating, just without the physical intimacy. And how often do you hang out? 3 or 4 times a week, Jake replied. Sometimes more if one of us is going through something difficult and needs emotional support. I turned back to Tessa, who was looking like she wanted to disappear. So let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, speaking clearly for the recording. You've been telling me that Jake is a work friend who you see as part of a group activity, while telling him that we're casual and non-exclusive so he wouldn't feel guilty about maintaining what is essentially a romantic relationship with you without the physical component. It's not romantic, Tessa protested weakly. 3 to 4 times a week, intimate dinners, emotional support, relationship advice, I listed. What would you call that? Jake was staring at Tessa with growing realization about how he'd been manipulated as well. You told me you and Ben weren't serious, he said accusingly. You said he was just someone you were seeing casually and that it wouldn't last long. That's not. Tessa began, but she couldn't finish the sentence because any explanation would reveal more lies. I decided it was time to reveal how much I actually knew about their ongoing relationship. I have screenshots of your social media history, I told Tessa calmly. Photos of you and Jake together as a couple for 3 years, and then photos of you continuing to hang out after your supposed breakup. I have documentation of inconsistencies in your stories about the friend group. I know Jake doesn't work at your company. Tessa's face went completely white as she realized that I'd been investigating her lies for weeks. You've been lying to both of us, I continued. You've been maintaining an emotional affair with your ex-boyfriend while telling me he was just a work friend, and you've been lying to him about the seriousness of our relationship so he wouldn't feel guilty about the inappropriate intimacy you've been sharing. I stopped the recording and put my phone away. Jake, I said, I'm sorry you got caught up in this. Tessa has been manipulating both of us, but now you know the truth about our relationship and can make informed decisions about whether you want to continue being involved with someone who lies this extensively. I turned back to Tessa one final time. And Tessa, since you apparently prefer maintaining close relationships with your ex-boyfriends over being honest with your current boyfriend, you're free to explore that preference as a single person. I walked away from the festival, leaving Tessa to explain to Jake why she'd been lying to both of us for months. The relationship was over, but more importantly, both Jake and I now understood exactly what kind of person we'd been dealing with. Sometimes the best response to deception is to let the deceiver expose themselves completely before walking away with your dignity intact. 3 months later, I heard through mutual friends that Tessa and Jake had tried to get back together, but it hadn't worked out, apparently because neither of them could trust someone who'd proven capable of such extensive manipulation. Some people are so committed to deception that they'll lie to everyone in their lives simultaneously. Tessa learned that this strategy eventually leads to losing everyone when the truth inevitably comes out.